Okay, the time is 6:34 p.m. I'd like to call this meeting to order of the Mobility and Transportation Infrastructure Commission for January 17th, 2023. And let's have the roll call.
Sure.
Present?
Commissioner Abelson,
Here.
Commissioner Dunlap,
Here.
Commissioner Hughes, Commissioner Zavala,
Here.
and to our new mayor, John Primmett.
Here.
Everyone's present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Commissioner Hughes to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
My pleasure. If everyone will rise, please. Face the flag. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes. Item number 1 on our agenda is public comment. Anyone from the public is welcome to comment on any subject affecting public works, as long as it is not on a topic that is on our agenda elsewhere. So I'd like to ask, is there anyone from the public that would like to speak? Yes, please give us your name and your address. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I put a card there. But my name is Casey Laws. I'm a scientist. I'm a resident of South Pasadena, and I'm also serving currently as a member of the Natural Resources and Environmental Commission as its chair. And I wanted to come today to discuss an issue of common interest, which is climate change. That might be traditionally considered an environmental issue, but of course, we know more and more every day about the issue. And one of the dominant effects and contributors to climate change is transportation. And so this commission is really where a lot of what we'd like to do in terms of environmental action takes place. And so I'm hoping that despite the fact that we've had this tremendous impact on the climate of the earth over the past 50 years of industrial activity on the earth, we're hoping that MTIC can be a part of the solution where we can change the patterns of development and how people use automobiles especially. So in particular, there's one thing that happened recently in the last couple of months. So the California Air Resources Board, CARB, issued a what's called the scoping plan. And I thought that would be relevant to some of the things that you're working on as you're developing your work plan for the new year and things that you might consider in terms of actions you might take. So the CARB has been tasked with defining the scope of how California will adapt to mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So GHGs, greenhouse gases. And the goal is to reach a level of emissions which are consistent with international treaties such as the Paris Accord, but also state law, right? And so that means that we're going to levels of subsequently lower and lower levels of GHG emissions at the years of 2030 and 2045. And now those years might seem kind of far off, but in fact, it's something that I think basically everyone here will see some impact from. So truly our economy will be decarbonized in our lifetimes. And it's something that I think we should all be thinking about as we take our actions in our daily life. Making that change is not really optional. We've already seen a global mean temperature rise on Earth of about 1 degree Celsius, so 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit. We're seeing the impact of that even recently with extreme weather events such as this flooding that we've had recently in California. And the goal of these reductions are to limit that rise to 1.5 Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a big change in the climate of Earth, but we need to act in order to mitigate and keep it at that level. Current trends are actually not very promising in terms of how people have mitigated their impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we should be taking action aggressively. So the scoping plan, that's the point here. That's our shared interest between NREC and MTIC. So the plan describes how we'll the scope of that work. How we're going to go from where we are today to where we need to be. And in particular, it talks about electrification, but also actual reduction in terms of vehicle miles traveled, reduction in terms of oil industry in California. All these things are a part of the scope of what needs to happen over the next 10 years and 25 years. And so for MTIC, as you develop your work plan over the next year, I hope you can consider some of the actions they recommend. These are things that are outside of state purview. So they're things that really have to happen at the city level. And so it's something that we can directly take on. So some specific things from the scoping plan are strategies relevant to cities, things like reimagine new roadway projects that decrease VMT, vehicle miles traveled, in a way that meets community needs and reduces the need to drive. And another point is a strategy that, quote, expand and complete planned networks of high quality active transportation infrastructure. So the MTIC has taken great action in this direction through the Mission Slow Street project. And I'm really happy to see that coming along. I hope that we can continue to expand upon projects like that. And as you consider your work plan for the next year. Now, specifically, the scoping plan has goals for VMT per capita. So there's a goal of being 25% below 2019 level in the year 2030. So that's 8 years from now, we should be 25% below where we were a couple of years ago. So that's the VMT per capita. 2045, we should be 30% below that level. Now, if you look at tracking of progress towards that goal over the past 10 years or so, we're not making much progress at all in terms of VMT per capita. It's really not decreasing. And we do have SB 375, which is about tracking that progress, shows that we're not really reaching that goal. So the scoping plan really sets a pretty high standard for us to improve upon what's been done before. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's something that we know we've tried before and have not made much progress on. So I'm hoping we can do better in the future. So specific actions that MTIC might consider in the next year: expand the slow streets and complete streets projects to new streets, create a safety plan to reduce the traffic related injury and death, and make sure that people can walk and live in the city without a car and not be at risk of injury or death. You can remove parking minimums in the city and make it easier for people to live without cars. And you can update the bicycle master plan and set a target for date for its implementation. These are all actions that we could take here that would improve our quality of life in the city and meet our goals as a city and as a state. So I hope you'll consider these things as you make your work plan. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Okay.
Hi, I appreciate the chance to comment during this meeting. My name is Matthew Thomas. I live in the Grand Avenue and Hermosa neighborhood, and I wanted to bring your attention to a series of slow signs that have been placed at intersections in the neighborhood on and off for roughly about the past 2 years. There are signs at the intersection of Grand and Hermosa, on Hermosa between Grand and Columbia, on Arroyo at the intersection of Columbia, on Arroyo at the intersection of Hermosa, and then on Arroyo at the intersection of Sterling Place. After a couple of sort of phone calls and email back and forths with Public Works and then some members of the city engineering team, and then a conversation on the phone with Ted Gerber, I found out that these signs are temporarily placed as part of the Slow Streets program, the residential streets subsection of that program. This was recently voted to continue at the city council. Ted Gerber explained this to me at the October 19th, 2022 city council meeting. And I wanted to comment about these signs because they present a significant safety issue to the community. For pedestrians and cyclists. A lot of these signs are placed in areas without a sidewalk and areas where people do unfortunately go quite fast sometimes. Unfortunately, what the signs end up accomplishing is that drivers are forced to err towards the curb when they are passing these signs, often at a high rate of speed. And when you're walking or walking a dog or biking, it often ends up that the car has to pass really close to you. I've actually had probably about 5 or 10 close incidents in the past few months with cars at these signs. And so I wanted to ask the city to remove them, and this is where I have been directed. I was told that they were part of the Slow Streets program and that they were a temporary placement more than 2 years ago.
After reading through the contract between the city and Alta Planning, which is executing this program, the contract says, and I'm quoting here, Active SGV will lead the installation and specific door-to-door outreach along the 3 slow streets corridors, Oak Street, Hermosa Street, and Grand Avenue. This outreach will be conducted by Active SGV to inform residents of the installation. To my knowledge, this outreach has not happened, but what I really want to draw your attention to is that it specifies Oak Street, Hermosa Street, and Grand Avenue. The signs on Arroyo, even though I was told that they were maintained by the city as a temporary placement for this program, don't seem like they can be part of the program if they're not specified to be one of the streets. Secondly, it says that the program will include temporary striping, curb extensions using reflective delineators, and bicycle lanes. These placements do not accomplish any of these goals or fit any of these descriptions. And so as much as I really do appreciate and support actions to make the city safer and more friendly towards cyclists and pedestrians, the ultimate impact of these signs is that it makes it more dangerous to be out and about in the city. So I'm not sure if this has to be referred past this committee to the city council or if it goes to Public Works, but ultimately I would like these signs to be removed well in advance of any action from Active SGV. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. As you know, we can't discuss any item that is not on the agenda, but I think you've made the Public Works Director aware of your concern, and the commission is well aware of the signs. And so your comments will be taken into consideration. So are there any more public comments, Leona? Okay, that's it. And we go now to agenda item number 2, the project status update from the Public Works Director, Ted Gerber.
Thank you, Chair Fisher, and good evening, council members, commissioners and mayor. So this is our first meeting of the year. As we do every month with our meeting, we release a status update of the capital improvement projects and the operations and maintenance projects. I will highlight a couple of them as I usually do, and then also offer an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have. One item that we don't consider necessarily a project, but is impactful on this report is that we are moving into expanding our staff, including a new transportation position. The position was budgeted this past year, and we had worked to go through a process to get it approved. The council made their final approval in December. And so we opened up the position for recruitment in December and just recently closed it about a week ago and received some applications. So our expectation is to conduct interviews next, and we hope that we'll have a manager on staff hopefully by March, but that also depends on the re-employment and the onboarding process. I mention this because, as you know, we don't have, at the moment, we don't have dedicated staff for transportation projects in the department, but this position is fully funded by transportation funds. And so it'll be 100% devoted to working on some of these projects. And so we hope to see some faster progress as this person will be responsible for the management of all these efforts. So with that said, I'll touch on a couple items. We did have our discussion on the North-South Corridor project at the end of last year. We took some of the comments from the commission and the public into consideration. Following that meeting, we had a meeting with the Caltrans and Federal Highway to discuss the scoping process and accessing those funds. There's still some back and forth to do with that agency. So our consultant KOA is assisting us with that. In the meantime, they're moving forward with the design elements of the contract and focusing on traffic signal synchronization as part of their scope and planning for the next outreach session. that we had discussed in November. With regards to some of the Measure M projects we had been discussing, and we went through a process last year to identify which ones we funded. We were awaiting those to be considered at Metro, at the Metro Planning and Program Committee for approval by Metro. The Planning and Programming Committee will be meeting tomorrow, and they will be recommending that 4 out of our 5 projects move forward for a funding recommendation to Metro and then later approved by Metro. The 5th project was the Garfield Monterey Signal. They had given us feedback that before that project moves towards funding recommendation, we should go through the signal warrant analysis step. However, the other 4 are on track as approved by the council. One of the other larger items is the Measure R funding. So our Measure R funding is currently appropriated to a handful of projects, the Fair Oaks and 110 interchange proposed improvements, as well as a portion of the funding towards the Fremont and Huntington project. Some of our shared projects with Pasadena are funded by Measure R on the Pasadena side. So we've been discussing and following along the approval process for this Measure R. Pasadena has submitted their list of projects, including some of our shared projects, such as the Columbia Orange Grove project. And those are expected to go to Metro for funding approval in February. So there's plenty more projects on here. Those are the ones I wanted to highlight, give you an update. I'm open to answering any questions you have about other projects on the list.
Are there any questions from commissioners regarding the projects that are listed? Commissioner Dunlap.
Thank you, Chair. Director Gerber, I have 2 quick questions. The Huntington Drive at Marengo Crossing Guard evaluation. Do I understand that crossing guard is already in place?
Yes,
Yeah.
the council approved the crossing guard for this school year. And so the purpose of this study was to evaluate whether or not, to provide information back to council so they make a decision about whether or not to continue that.
Cool. Thank you. And then one other question. A resident of Oak Street reached out. They saw the item on that there was a meeting, or there will be a meeting in January regarding the Ramona Avenue, Oak Street, Rollins Street, Fremont Avenue traffic management plan. Has that meeting happened, and is that open? Can I connect that resident with you?
So let me give you a little background on this. We had there's 2 efforts underway. One is working with residents who live around Holy Family to correct some of the traffic issues there.
Right.
And then one was to install a loading zone in front of the high school on Fremont to alleviate some of the sort of stop and drop traffic that's happening in the middle of the street and pull it over to a loading zone. So when we've been giving updates to this commission on that project, and I think during our last meeting or the meeting before, a number of residents had signed a letter to the commission stating that they were concerned about the project.
Okay.
And so our next action was to meet with those residents to explain what we were doing. And so we've been making those arrangements. We've scheduled a meeting for this Thursday at 5 o'clock or 5:30, I think it is. So it's not necessarily like an open public meeting. It was really just to address those concerns, but certainly maybe if that resident's in that
I'll
area.
direct that person to you, and
Sure, yeah,
provide them.
I don't think
Thank
it'd be an issue
Yeah,
for them to join.
thank you.
Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Director Gerber. A couple things. On the Fair Oaks signal synchronization, that we've got all that in place. Do we have a strategy of how we're going to utilize that? Do we have an action plan as what if a queue happens at certain points? We're going to change the light structure. If we know that there's a big events, a la Rose Bowl, do we have a plan on how we're going to utilize that to maximize the investment?
Yes, so that is a large part of the scope for KOA under the current north-south corridor ITS deployment project, in which they will give us several different options to run the signals. I don't recall exactly what our phase approach is at the moment, but it had something that, you know, it's along the lines of like AM, PM, weekend event type of configurations. So we still have to nail down exactly what that will look like. Some of it comes out of the feedback from the community from the outreach session, but we've certainly given KOA our feedback about the traffic congestion on the corridor and trying to address that for certain times of the day. And so that's supposed to be an element of the current project that's underway.
And then on the Measure M, you've been talking about the funds, Metro. Fundamental question. We've been operating for a number of years that this money is there, and this is how we're going to spend it on X projects. Is there any concern of any money being not put forth? If they say, no, we don't like that, I mean, obviously they've sent us back on the Garfield, Monterey with the signal, asking us to do X additional work. Is there any concern or consideration that there's any loss of any funding?
There's no concern of that. So the way the MSP program works is the money is given to the entire region, including us, Burbank, Glendale, La Cañada, Flint Ridge, Pasadena, and a little bit of LA County. And so we meet regularly, and our options are to either go in on a joint regional project to spend the money or split it up on some basis. In the past, we've split it up, and actually we met recently and decided to continue that work. Not so much because everybody wants their own project. It's just that it's hard for us to do a regional project with those particular cities. We're encouraging in the group that we partner with Pasadena on projects, which is how we are spending that money. We're doing that Columbia project, and then perhaps like, you know, Burbank and Glendale will join up. But we've decided that we'll continue dispersing the money on a per capita basis. So with that said, the money stays in the region. And since we've agreed to do this per capita distribution, there's not a risk per se of that money being lost. If there's any risk, it's that the money will not be approved for the project that we want it appropriated for. And so that's what we're kind of seeing here. Most of our projects went through, but in order for Metro to approve that final one, they want some more of the feasibility work done to show that that money will lead to design and construction work.
I guess my fear is we worked really hard when we first had to submit the projects list back to 2017 and such, and got in before a lot of the other cities got in their plans. And we, because of our lack of funds, lack of personnel, have always, you know, we struggle, as you've been saying, we don't have a traffic engineer. We don't have, so my fear is that other cities will come in and say, we're ready. We've got shovel ready. Let us have the funds. We're ready. And it could be siphoned off or seen again as a region. And we've worked really hard for many years to try to make sure that, you know, that the improvements and things we didn't do or should have done or could have done. So in lieu of not in fighting the freeway that could have been done. So we just don't want to lose out our fair share. The same thing with, we don't want to lose what we've promised in trying to fix the 110 freeway loop hook. That because we've waited and waited in designs and all this, that we're going to lose because personnel is changing, the Metro board is changing. And we just want to make sure that we protect the city's interests and the, you know, the improvements we want to make the city much more, and to kind of address what we can do to help with the transportation for the climate, to make things more efficient, so we don't end up with the backups that we have and the things that we've experienced for so many years, to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to keep all those funds designated for us, and to fight for the projects we think are really important and whatever we need to do for them. And the last question I had was on the Fremont Huntington, sort of like you talked about reaching out. You list that we're going to have a scope of meetings. Do you know when those are going to be
So the Fremont Huntington project's interesting because as I had mentioned, it's funded by both a Measure M Metro Active Transportation Program and Measure R Mobility Improvement Program, which have different processes. So the money that we've been awarded does not cover any sort of early planning or feasibility work. The city was given funding agreements to spend that money, but only starting with design. And so there is a planning aspect that has to occur. There's environmental review that has to occur. And so what we're trying to do right now is jump into that process and get it moving. It requires, planning analysis and public community meetings. And so what we're trying to do right now is scope. We already have a scope to do that with an on-call consultant. But it's an expensive endeavor and we don't necessarily have funding from those programs for it. We have city funding that we can use. And so we're trying to figure out how to schedule, budget, and complete that work soon with public input so that we can move on to spending the actual design and construction money.
Are you thinking soon, meaning within 2023?
I mean, we were hoping within the next couple months. I
Oh.
mean, we were hoping to do in January. We couldn't get the contracting part of it straightened out just yet. So now we're targeting February. But that's where we are. So we're ready to do that. We've already met with one of the community groups and they're, have bated breath to get started and jump in. We just have to get all those pieces in a row. Which again, is something that's a staff intensive process to line all that up.
Thank you. One caveat to add to that might be when we look at some of that, because Fremont is such an important corridor, that we don't think just the people there, that we make it so that it's kind of a citywide, because it'll show in the impact that has the people interested on Fair Oaks, people interested on other streets.
So I'm glad you
Et
mentioned that
cetera.
actually. So
That we
our
can
approach.
Make sure people know, because it's
Yeah,
such a vital artery.
So actually what we've done here is we've done a 3-corridor scope. And we're trying to just sort of portion out the parts for the different, trying to break it up enough to have the different projects segregated by costs, but get it all done together. We approached one of our on-call firms to do Huntington, Fair Oaks, and Fremont as sort of this sort of combined corridor approach. There's other streets, of course, but those are our, major concerns as far as their integrated corridor management altogether. So that's where we're trying to address it. Pasadena is also a part of that with Pasadena Avenue. That's a little harder to address because then we're getting into stuff that's outside of our city. But again, trying to just sort of get that scope just right so we can do a higher level evaluation and not just focus just on the street, just like you said.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Herbert. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any questions from the other commissioners? Commissioner Abelson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director Gerber. Just one question for you on Measure M. So you mentioned the Garfield Monterey proposed signal, that was one that currently was not approved by this. Is it Metro, the Joint Powers Authority?
It was Metro. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt
go
you.
ahead.
So what happened was we had a lot of back and forth with there's 2 parts I want to address here. So the way this works is as a joint power authority, we basically hire a consultant, all of us, all the cities together to help us with this application process. And so there was a lot of back and forth between each city and the consultant, and then back and forth between the consultant and Metro about each project. So like, for example, somebody who wanted to buy buses, there was some questions about be more explicit about what the buses are for, what kind of buses, how much, et cetera. We had a lot more of a detailed scope, but one of the Metro's major concerns was that just like our other funding sources, none of this money is going into feasibility work. They want to see design and construction only. So while the other projects could clearly get funding could be allocated for design and construction because they were design and construction projects, even if there's feasibility work that we have to do ahead of time on those projects, we wouldn't ask for Measure M money on it. The Garfield and Monterey clearly couldn't move forward at all without the warrant analysis. Unlike the other projects where, it's best practice, but maybe not necessarily required. On the signal, it's required. So that's why Metro had said, it wasn't rejected. It was just said, this one's not going to move forward right now. Do your warrant analysis and then come back.
Okay.
And it worked out because it wasn't on our, the other projects were in the nearer term as far as our work. That one was a little bit longer, so we can catch up and get it back on the list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So
Sure.
just a couple of comments and a question about that. So the interesting thing about Garfield Monterey is that's been on our list since day one and was originally approved. And then through a series of developments, everything was, we decided to deprogram and then start fresh. But this was when it's just interesting. This was originally on the list, originally approved and scheduled to proceed. So I'm just concerned that we're sort of a few steps back. However, it sounds like all we need to do is conduct the warrant analysis, and assuming it's warranted, then we're back where we need to be. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's
Same.
where we are. So I'm not sure what happened last time. It could have been that we did a warrant analysis that time. We're not aware of
wasn't
it.
done, but
Okay, all
It
right.
wasn't brought up as a reason not to approve it. So,
Sure, yeah.
but that's, so I just was wondering, is the warrant analysis something that can be conducted by one of our on-call consultants? And if so, and whether or not, but hopefully so, is there a timeline on when we might be able to conduct that?
Absolutely. And we've already engaged one of the consultants on this. Their concern was that if we, this isn't this is just, I'm just giving you to how it is here. Their concern was that conducting the warrant analysis and not having the construction funds committed might be a problem with the timing, because the warrant analysis would basically start us along the process that we have to build it. We might not have construction money, and then we're pulling the money from somewhere we didn't want to pull it to get it built. So the timing of the warrant analysis is key. I think we can start it sooner or later, but I just don't know that detail just yet. I don't want to put us in a position that the cart before the horse on the analysis.
But isn't it a chicken and the egg? Because didn't you just say that they won't approve signing construction money until we have a warrant analysis saying that it's warranted?
Not exactly, because it just depends on when our next bite of the apple to get the Measure M money approved is. And that's another thing that we're working out with the other cities right now. There's a thought that, and I had to clarify this with the other cities, which I've asked, we were supposed to talk about it today. Since we do that, we've done in the past, we've done this sort of 5-year review. Like, we had committed about 5 years of funding this year. And we get new funding every year. So the administrative process, I was talking about that back and forth, it can be expensive. And so you don't necessarily want to do it every year, because then you're spending administrative funds to get a small amount of money allocated, whereas you might want to spend the same amount of administrative funds to get a lot of money allocated. So for the future spending years, which for future money, we might want to wait to reallocate Measure M funding. However, there's an opportunity to do like an amendment in the middle of the cycle. And that's where we would probably take the Garfield back, would be an amendment, because it's already been submitted, and just amending it with that warrant analysis. So I just have to clarify what that process is so we can get the timing to line up. So we go to the warrant analysis, and then we submit for the amendment, and the timing's right in order. So I think that process happens this year, 2020. I think it happens all the time, the amendment process. We just have to get that lined up, because the formal submittal process, as I understand it, I might be correct tomorrow, is that we will be waiting until our next big Measure M review, which is also the reason that we haven't reviewed the Measure M list yet. It was on the work plan for this month, but it might not, we might not be doing it in the next couple of months, because we won't be sending another Measure M list to council this fiscal year. So there's a couple of things in play to sort out. I hope that answers the questions. I
That-
know it's
That's
complicated.
very helpful. No, I
Okay.
understood. Thank you very much.
Of course.
I had one question, on the Fair Oaks traffic signal project. Is KOA doing the signal timing?
Yes.
Okay. And have they, started that, or have they started the models or simulation yet?
Yeah, they're working on it. We haven't seen anything yet. So we haven't, our first priorities are, addressing the concerns from, Caltrans and Federal Highway about our scope adjustment. And then also, making sure that we've got the public outreach, scheduled. So they're doing that work in the background, but we haven't reviewed any of that synchronization work yet.
Okay. The gentleman who was here, from the public spoke about reducing greenhouse gases, the need for it, and ideas for getting that accomplished. Generally, with the signal synchronization project, it will reduce the stop and go, which consumes a lot of fuel and releases a lot of air emissions. The purpose of a project is to keep traffic moving as much as possible at a moderate speed. And it has those types of benefits. So I trust that KOA will be doing those analyses and timing plans and a simulation of reduced greenhouse gases, air emissions, reduced fuel consumption, et cetera. And I would like those shown in the project status when those figures become available. I think they're good figures to have.
Sure. Don't know, if it's been a while since I looked at the scope, and I don't know if any of it is dedicated to giving us those types of figures. I'm sure we could get them derived either from KOA or someone else for, GHG reductions based on timing changes. I don't know if it's specifically in there for them to
It
do.
may not be, but usually
it's something
it's
we could do,
conducted.
yeah.
Right, if it's not conducted, then you can advise.
Yeah.
But
In fact, from the environmental side, one of our objectives in this quarter, at the end of this quarter, is to do another greenhouse gas emissions, inventory. We had done that years ago when we passed the climate action plan. And so it's time for us to reevaluate that inventory and basically see if we've gained any reductions. So that's, that might be a cross opportunity to have it done at that stage, but
okay,
definitely, noted.
all right, thank you. Any other comments? If not, we'll go to item number 3, information report, but a big one. So we'll go to Public Works Director Gerber.
Thank you, Chair Fisher. Liana, if you don't mind pulling up that presentation. So the commission had received a presentation from community development in early 2021 about various development projects that were underway as an informational item. We had hoped to do that again. Community development is very caught up in a lot of different work right now. And so what we decided to do was provide you an informational update on the 2 projects that were recently approved by the Planning Commission that Public Works did the peer review on the transportation impact analysis reports. But also along with that, give you a brief overview of how these development projects are reviewed for traffic impact analysis and the actual adopted methodology for doing that. So the city actually has a resolution that adopts this methodology. So we'll be doing both. We'll review, cursory development projects. Bear with me. It's been a little while since I've read these reports thoroughly, so I can just do my best to answer your questions, but I'll give you the overview of the projects and then also overview of the methodology. So next slide. So our transportation impact analysis, or our TIA methodology guidelines, as I mentioned, is adopted by council, was done in adopted in 2020. Is effort, I believe, by Iteris. And it's a requirement based on Senate Bill 743 And then an impacted change to the to CEQA, an amendment to CEQA in 2019. So California Environmental Quality Act requirements. And the major change that that came about was migrating from a level of service only approach, i.e. congestion and delay, to a vehicle miles traveled approach, where we're measuring on a per capita basis, people for a development project that would equate to residents and employees, the number of vehicle trips they generate for each project and the distances traveled to and from. Now, I realize that there's people on this commission that know way more than even we do about this, so please chime in if you have a question or want to make a note about something in this that we're missing that's important for the public to hear about. So we adopted these guidelines in 2020. However, in the interest of also addressing congestion and delay, when the city adopted the VMT guidelines, they also added in as an option, well, not as an option, the methodology, but it was not required of the law, but the city required developers to go through the level of service analysis in addition to the VMT analysis. So there's two items they have to accomplish when they do their evaluation, and that is for traffic delays. Next slide, Liana, thank you. So as I mentioned, there's two components that each development project considers. There's the CEQA transportation impact analysis, where in essence, the evaluator is reviewing whether there's a conflict with the city's plans, for example, the general plan, whether the project increases hazards, or it impacts emergency access, such as emergency vehicle access. And so per the law, the methodology offers the screening criteria. And so projects can meet one or more of these criteria, and we'll go through those. And if they do, it's presumed that there's no significant impact under those conditions. So for example, projects close to transit. So then we assume there's no CEQA impact, or the project is not above a VMT baseline. So there's no CEQA impact. We'll talk about those in a second. So that's the first part. The second part is what South Pasadena does under the local traffic assessment and mitigation measures. And this is where we do a calculation to evaluate level of service at the subject intersections and see if there's a delay. So the delay would be for vehicles moving through the intersection. And then also the delay would be for queuing at the intersection, both, could be for a queuing in a turn pocket or just queuing in the straightaway lane. Thanks. So let's talk about the screening criteria here for 1 second. So there's a long list, and these how projects might be qualified to not continue in doing additional VMT or additional CEQA analysis. So first one is small project size. So a project that identifies that it's creating fewer than 100 trips per day can qualify for small project size. If a project is in a low VMT area, and I'll show you what that means in the next slide, but they can also qualify. So we have a map that shows where low VMT areas are. And so if projects in that low VMT area, they can qualify to be screened out. If they're within a transit priority area, and I think that our methodology allows this to be within a half mile. So, this is really impactful for projects that are within a half mile of the Mission Meridian stop. If they are a retail project, so if they're a project that's serves a neighborhood, is a retail facility serving a neighborhood then it's less than 50,000 square feet, that can be basically considered a local retail location. There's the affordable housing part of it. So if a development can be considered a less than significant impact with the majority of their affordable housing over 50%. And the portions of the development project that have less than 50% affordable housing. There's also two more redevelopment projects. This is where I get a little hazy on exactly what all these means. But basically replacement of an existing land use that generates less VMT than its previous use, so a VMT reduction. And then a project that can be demonstrated that it serves a community such as a school or a park. So those are the screening criteria. And so when we were talking about low VMT traffic analysis zones, this is what we're talking about. So bifurcating the city along Mission and Arroyo there, and then cutting down part of the southwest Monterey Hills. The blue area there has been designated as below 85% of the county average for VMT. And so if a project's in that area, then it's presumed that it's not a significant impact. If it's in the gray area, it has to still continue on through the process. Similarly, for the next slide, when we talk about transit priority areas, I mentioned if it's within a half mile of that transit priority area, it can be screened out. And then to simplify the process on the next slide, it basically combines the two maps and shows you, if it's in one of those two or not. This part's pretty straightforward.
Ted,
Yes.
could you go back to that map you just showed?
Yes.
Which part is excluded from analysis?
The blue part, which is the majority of the city.
Does not have to be analyzed further?
If it meets one of those criteria, whether if it's a project that has it's in a transit priority area or it's in a low VMT area.
So therefore, almost no project in the city would have a impact.
Well, so it's an interesting question. It just means that it's presumed to be non-significant impact, but that's rebuttable. So like if it can be demonstrated that there is a significant impact, then the screening criteria is basically like a first level filtering process. However, this is, I would imagine this was the intent of why the methodology was drafted, to have the second part that we're going to go into, which is the local traffic impact or the local traffic assessment. So this would screen somebody out from having to do further CEQA requirements, but it wouldn't necessarily screen someone out from having to do any traffic mitigation. Because if we find, and we'll get into this in the next section, if we find that a development project does have an impact to level of service or queuing, then we can still require that the project has mitigative measures. So this isn't like a thing, this doesn't get you off the hook. It basically can ease your CEQA evaluation process. If that makes sense.
I want to move on, but
Sure.
if I understand, again, I commend the city and I commend the Public Works Department for requiring the queuing analysis and the level of service analysis. But strictly for state CEQA purposes, is all the area shown in blue excluded from showing that there's an impact?
So it depends question. Sorry it's kind of a legal question, because yes, in that the initial screening, a developer could claim, I'm in the blue area, I don't have to do any further CEQA analysis. However, that can be challenged, that they would have to do further CEQA analysis for other reasons. And so it's basically that's that first level of screening. So for the two projects we'll look at today, not to, spoiler alert, they meet screening criteria that allows them to not continue with a further CEQA analysis. However, we still had them go through that level of service analysis and queuing. Spoiler alert, again, we didn't have an issue with that when we did that evaluation, or when the consultant did that evaluation that we peer reviewed. So I know you're looking for a yes or no, but it's more like yes until is the answer. If that makes sense.
Chair Fisher, may I ask a quick procedural question only? Because because I think a lot of us had the same reaction when we looked at the chart before us. And you said that it creates a rebuttable presumption, right? That no detailed CEQA analysis is required. But you said it's rebuttable and that it can be challenged. My question is that something that the city is in a position to or ever does, or is that up to private citizens or interest groups and such to do? Because reading what the analysis that was conducted for these two projects met the screening threshold, so it wasn't required. So I was just wondering, is this something that the city can do or ever does do, or no? It's up to the public if they want to challenge or overcome that presumption.
Sure. It's a very difficult question. I'm sorry, it's one I can't answer because there's other levels of requirements in state law and housing laws and well, I'd say requirements that would add into that decision of whether a city would accept it or not, if that makes sense. My understanding of the process is that whether or not something should be CEQA challenges, both it could be, I think it could be both done by the city and anybody, somebody in the private sector. I think that it's the city, and specifically the community development department, that actually makes the CEQA determination. And so, as I understand it, the developer would make the case that this is a CEQA, that this removes them from further CEQA processing. And so the city could say no because of this other reason. So I think the answer to your question is yes, the city could do that. I don't know if they have done that or do it because of other types of requirements that they have to consider when they're making that determination.
Okay. Right, thank
Sorry
you.
again, I
No,
know it's probably
that's
frustrating
great.
to hear an answer like that, but
Thank you.
Ted, is it fair to say that this is really just transportation, that there are other aspects of CEQA that the project would need to go through, environmental, but as far as like looking at transportation further or mitigating transportation impacts, this would
absolutely.
screen them out for.
Yeah, absolutely.
mitigation.
So, for one of these projects, there was an air quality analysis, noise analysis. We do an arborist analysis. So there's other elements that, and it kind of goes into that question is like, if there's other concerns at the environmental impact stage, then it might be one whole consideration. Okay.
Thank you.
And so, turning to the second part of the methodology, the local traffic assessment, and that is done particularly by looking at level of service. So what we mean by level of service is, and this is how we do it, is taking a look at the amount of delay in intersection. So if you see here on the left, you've got a chart for signalized intersections. So what this means is if the delay through the intersection is less than or equal to 10 seconds, and we consider that a level A. Similarly, if the delay is greater than 80 seconds, then it'd be considered a level F, which is worse, obviously. So on the right, you have unsignalized intersections, same idea, but different thresholds, because obviously signalized intersections take longer by the nature of their signalized, whereas unsignalized intersections do not. And then we also take a look at the queuing, which is when a existing queue, meaning a line of cars at an intersection, is lengthened by 25 feet or causes a queuing to extend beyond the turn pocket by 25 feet. So those are the types of things that we look at. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. I think that might be, oh, there we go. Okay, so we've looked at I want to say we've looked at two major development projects. There was a third smaller conditional use project that we didn't include here. And then of course we have development projects that we look at, multiple a week. But they're mostly, small residential or small commercial. These are the ones that are large impacts, and that's why I bring them to your attention here. So we have 815 Fremont, which you're probably all familiar with, but you can see up there on the left is the Caro site. And then down there on the bottom is just the rendering of what it could look like as Arbor Square. And then on the right, oh, I'm sorry, one more second. No, you're fine. On the right, you can see it's hard to see, but that's the layout of the street near Mission and Fremont where this would be located and the numbered intersections that were included in the evaluation. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. And so we'll kind of go through these together because it's just easier to talk about the process with them together. But this is the 1020 El Centro. We didn't have a good rendering in the report, so I'm sorry, it's just a white block, but this is the old school site. So on the bottom of the parcel, you can see the old school administration building. And then above that would be the new residential condo units. So, and then this is the study intersections for the El Centro project. So we saw the first one on the 815 Fremont. And so here you can see that gray area is the project. And then we've got study intersections at on Mission, Fairview, and Fremont. And the ones that are black are signalized and the two that are white are unsignalized. So how does this work? So typically these projects go by evaluation. And again, many of you know this, but by evaluating the generation of trips. So if we're looking at VMT, we're looking at vehicle miles traveled, which is we have to take a look at, the number of trips that are taken and how far do they go. So we want to look at the net effect of the trip generation. So a particular site, like a high density restaurant like Caro's, has a number of trips that it already entertains each day. When we remove Caro's and we add this development site, we're going to have, more or less trips. And so the idea is looking at the net effect between those two scenarios and whether that's going to have an impact. So the first thing to do is take a look at the existing number of trips that occur for the site. And so you can see here for the peak periods, the number of trips for Caro's is 282. And you can see the math here. It might be confusing how these are derived, but basically there's a standard developed by the Institute of Transportation Engineers that will give you a breakdown of how many trips for a particular type of business, for a particular region. And there's a whole bunch of other factors you can put into there. If you're really interested in this, it's all in the appendix of the reports that were linked in the staff report, but it really breaks down piece by piece how this works. It even goes as far to evaluate trips that occur within the same complex and end in the same complex. So in other words, you live upstairs, you go down to get food, you go back up to your apartment. You're not necessarily a vehicle traveled, but you are a trip that would be included in the standard list because you ate food that day and you went to a restaurant, but it actually has to be pulled out of the evaluation because it's not a vehicle that's traveling to and from the facility. So the process can get very complicated. And obviously there's an art to how it's done. But that's what you're seeing here in terms of developing the number of trips.
Ted, I just have a question. The existing use trip counts, based on what you were just saying, so they are not actual counts. It's a formula that's used to determine that number. Is that right?
They do counts for part of the process, but to determine how many trips are generated, they do it this way based on like a calculation. Yes.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
trip number is not an actual number. It's some factor determination based on commonly accepted formulas and such.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, because we'll get into this when we talk about what we're going to do next to mitigate any possibility of future issues. But when you're talking about how to predict what it would look like, you have to do it by, you don't have that information yet because it's not built. So you have to do it by this trip process. So it makes sense to do, to compare apples to apples in terms of your trip generation, if that makes sense.
I don't know if I agree with you, but I understand what
Sure. Well, I didn't create the methodology. I'm just, I wish I was that
But-
astute to figure this out.
But I might add that this is just the starting point, and they look at the number of trips. And then you have to analyze, well, how many are coming from the south? How many coming from the north? And then you have to factor that, and that information is not available. You can count trips, you can count the number of automobiles coming into your parking lot. But it's very difficult to say, well, he came from the south or he came from the west. So that's why they kind of use this commonly accepted practice.
Yeah, exactly. And they can do what you're saying, Chair Fisher, but they have to do it with obviously like a computer model. They take into consideration land uses, trips, traffic counts. Again, if you go into the appendices of this report, you'll see hundreds of pages of, just data. And then they can usually derive, 20% come from this direction, 10% from this direction, 50 from this direction, and they'll provide that information.
Ted, is the numbers calculated based on, I'm going to call regular business as opposed to pandemic experience? Because there was a lot of pickup versus, DoorDash. I mean, the numbers were calculated pre-pandemic numbers or experiences for the property?
It's a great question because we're gonna run into this as we discuss this. So the trip generation is unaffected because it's based on like long-term model data. However, the counts that we'll get into that affect the second part of the evaluation do get affected by that. And in fact, for the 1020 Essential project, the counts had to be augmented with a factor, and we'll talk about that a little bit because of that. So it's a good point, and it did come up with the Planning Commission for these projects.
Ted, can you remind me, is there an urban and rural component of the trip gen manual? If I recall correctly, these are national numbers. Some of these studies are done in Billings, Montana, or
I believe
Moines,
so.
Iowa.
Yeah, there's a level of factors, and you're right. There's a I don't know what you would call it, but basically some type of environment. And so a rural would have a different impact. Rural restaurant would have a different than an urban, and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, and I feel like it might even I don't recall. It's been a while since I looked at this.
Yeah,
But
luckily I haven't.
it might even be
this in
done
a
by
while.
region also on top of that. Okay, so then next slide, Leanna, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I jump around here? Okay, no, there we are. Thank you. So so then there's the next logical step to that, which is calculating the number of trips that would occur from the proposed project. And then you get your total net trips, basically. So in this case, the peak total net trips are 81. And again, spoiler, that's less than the 100 trips per day screening criteria that we talked about in the beginning.
So put simply, this means that the project is expected to generate an additional 81 trips.
During peak times,
peak
there would be many more trips during that day, but the evaluation is basically at what's the situation at the worst time.
Thanks.
Sure. Standard.
Daily, 81 daily trips, if I read the last column correctly.
Yes, that is daily. I'm sorry, you're right. That is daily. I think the other project did it based on the tables based on peak. So I think you're right. Yeah, because if we look at peak there, it does not add up to 81.
And this analysis comes from the developer, is that right? Or is this something done by the city or a city consultant?
It comes, another good question. It comes from a consultant. So we've had projects where the city's hired the consultant, and we've had projects where the developer hired a consultant. The ironic thing is they're usually the same consultants. So we're pulling from the same batch of people. The consultants that were used on these projects that were hired by the consultant are the same projects that are on our on-call list that we use for the same type of work, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So
But in this case.
in this
Yeah,
case,
it's fine. I was just wondering.
in this case, we hired the consultant. In the 1020 case, the developer hired the consultant.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in either case, the developer is the one ultimately paying the cost. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. In the case where the developer hires the consultant, it's a little easier contractually. We actually had a problem with this particular one that we hired the consultant because, the contract expired. We needed a little more money. They paid for it, but we had to go through the processes, as I know you understand from our current status of projects, where we have to go through this difficult contractual process sometimes to get it going.
Okay.
Now, with that said, we do the peer review of all the projects. And so if they don't follow the methodology, which sometimes they don't, or if they don't use reasonable figures, then we will require that they revise it so that it meets our standard.
And the peer review is conducted by staff.
Yes, by staff. Yeah.
Thank you.
So jump into same situation for 1020 El Centro. So here you can see this lists both the existing, the project, and the new trips in one table. And this is, I think, peak trips at the bottom you can see there. Because I think that this generated maybe over 1,000 trips per day. So it wouldn't meet that criteria. That is a small project size. However, it does meet a different criteria that it's near a transit stop.
But Ted, what did they base that on? Because the property's been vacant. The big issue is they've used it. I mean, was it based on when school was in session there and the administration was in session? Or is it, how do you calculate versus the parking for farmer's market? I mean,
Yeah.
what did they calculate for this?
So that's a
property?
good question. So you can see here, like the proposed project in the center of the table, they've used what they're going to build here, which I think is 108 condominium units. So they have multifamily housing, a shopping center, and high turnover restaurant. And so they're showing that would, for morning peak hour, a total of 122 new trips, and for afternoon peak hour, a total of 111 trips. And so they're going to subtract the existing usage, which you're getting at, which is not much. It's basically the office, administrative building, which was the previous usage, and it's not many trips. It comes down to 11 during the peak hour. So there's not really a big deduction on this one. It's very clear that there will be an increase of trips. So, part of the requirement is that the developer, thank you, Liana, that the developer consider the cumulative impact of the project. And so they will take into account all of the other projects and their trip generation in that consideration. So here you can just see other projects that were in the area. And then they, will consider, how does that impact? And so when they do their evaluation, they take that into account as well. So talking about, I'm sorry, next slide, Liana. So in talking about, I know we're going to jump here pretty quickly, but in talking about the level of service criteria, this is where we consider the actual volume, well, the expected volume of travel versus the expected volume of travel. So what you're seeing here are two charts. This is based on criteria from the city's general plan, which is saying for these particular streets, given their size. So, Mission is at the moment is a 4-lane street. Fremont is a 2-lane street. What's the average daily volume that we expect on that street? And so we take the average daily volume figure, and if an intersection can support that daily volume with really no negligible delay, then we can consider that a level service A. If the street can't support that daily volume, for whatever reason, not even considering the project, but the street just can't support that daily volume, and there's a major delay, then it would get a level service of F. So what you're seeing here is, given the expected average daily volume based on the circulation and the general plan, without considering the project, we take a look at where do those streets rate in terms of their level of service. You can see Mission is, an A for part of the day, creeps into, B during peak hours. But then along Fremont, you can see that the existing level of service for much of the day is already at an E level. And so this is important when we take a look at mitigative strategies in determining what's the change in level of service, because the city will only introduce a mitigative strategy if the level of service degrades. So if I have a level of service A before the project, and I'm going to have a level of service of C before the project, we'll implement a mitigative strategy. But if I'm a level E before the project and I'm still level E after the project, there's no mitigation required of the developer because nothing has changed. The street was already a low, a low level service, and it continues to be that way, if that makes sense. So here you're establishing the baseline for the level of service. Next slide, Liana. And so the evaluation continues by using the actual count data to evaluate the level of service, and then comparing what the existing situation will be today. So let's say, what you're seeing right here is comparing, you've got a couple columns. You've got your existing level of service, your existing control delay, how many seconds it takes to get to the intersection. And the brackets mean that it's unsignalized. You've got signalized and unsignalized intersections there. And then the level of service. So for example, Fremont Avenue at Gravalia Street for the AM peak hour, it's a 47-second delay. That's a level of service D under current conditions, 2022, when the evaluation, when this was done, conditions. So then adding in the project, and this is all done through the modeling process, you can see that the level of service doesn't change. It stays as D. There's no change in the control delay, and therefore there's no significant impact. And so you can see how this propagates down, even when you have control delays that increase. So in the PM on line number 1, Fremont Avenue and Gravalia, where you start with a level of E and you increase by 0.7 seconds, you're still at a level E. So even though you have a slight delay, you don't have a required mitigation. So this is also done for the future. If you jump to the next slide. Sorry, one back. So you can see this is the future. So considering, say, 2024, and basically by increasing the population in the model, and then also adding the project in. So the future would be without the project, and then future plus project would be in the future with the project. And so you can see the same evaluations done and comparing the level of service between before and after, and then there's no impact. Okay, next slide. So, same different format table, but same situation for the 5 intersections for El Centro, same evaluation done, taking a look at the level of service, which are much higher because we're on Mission Street, but no change. You can see some slight changes in the delay. Actually, in one case, it got better by 0.1 seconds, but no local impact. Next slide. And then the same thing for the future. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. And so the second part of that LOS evaluation is taking a look at queuing. And so what they do here is in that model, they took a look at, in particular, turn pocket lengths. And then they, if you've ever seen these models, you can actually have them generate visual output. I think we might have looked at one last year where you can actually see the cars moving, and then you can see, they get stacked up into an intersection. And when they cross that 25-foot threshold, then we see that there's an impact. So where some of these projects, you didn't see that 25 feet. In the text, you'll see that they'll say that, for example, the 1020 El Centro project, you might increase the queue in one instance by like half a car for a particular part of the day. So, half a car is not a significant impact. doesn't meet that 25-foot threshold. And so there'd be no significant impact to queuing. And so the consultant will explain this based on how they do their on-site circulation. So for example, for the A15 Fremont project, there's 2 driveways. There's one off of Fremont for the ground level. But that Fremont driveway is intended for a smaller amount of parking spaces to serve the commercial area. Very similar to how Carro's works already.
But isn't that going to be a problem because right now does it look like it's going to be in the same, roughly the same position because it looked like from the drawing that it was going to be slightly to the south, which means you don't have a lot of space from when you just come off when you're coming into the past the intersection. And then you're going to be making a left-hand turn, right? You're gonna have to wait for the southbound to come. And are you going to back up then into the intersection into Mission?
Sure. So the way that they had this proposed was that there was enough space. Well, let me add that for the residential section, the residential component of the building, the driveway and the parking access is off of Hope. So ideally, they don't have that impact on Fremont from people who are accessing it other than for the commercial space, similar to the restaurant. The additional units for residences would not enter off of Fremont. And so I think that the way they had this design, it's been a little while since I saw it, was that they had like a pocket driveway off of Fremont so that people could turn into it and then enter the ground level garage. And I think that one of the ideas, I don't recall exactly, was that they're not actually going underground, so they can drive right into the garage facility versus, people tend to pause when they're going down into an underground facility.
So I just worry it's going to back up because you're going to have so much, you always have continuous southbound Fremont. You have nothing to stop you until the signal, but you're beyond the signal. You're
Sure,
north of
sure.
the signal.
So I'll jump ahead and say that concern was shared by many people. Though the modeling and the data doesn't show that to be the case, obviously a lot of this is done on predictive information. And so what we did, it's slightly different between the two projects, but we are requiring them to redo this process after the project is built to identify if that is going to be an issue. And then there would have to be a mitigative strategy in terms of modifying that driveway entrance or prohibiting turns or, providing some loading, queuing loading on their property in order to mitigate that. So though there's no impact demonstrated by the evaluation that allows us to alter, that would promote altering the design, we put a safeguard in place, and it's under what we call the conditions of approval. So that in order for the project to actually take occupancy and fill, they would have to meet that requirement.
Do we have the same problem when you look at the El Centro property? Because right now they've got it looked like there's one of the entrances is on Diamond. We already know that Diamond is so narrow. We've had so many issues with that anyway, with north-south traffic on that street, parking, non-parking, farmers market. If that is going to be one of their entrances, where there's, it has the entrance to the parking lot of the schoolyard now, but a lot of times it's blocked. It's not open all the time, so you don't have that. But if this is going to be one of their main entrances for either the commercial or the residential, then that's potentially a problem there too.
We absolutely agreed with that. And so we actually prohibited usage for the facility on Diamond. Diamond, the condition that we put in place was that it was only for service entry for like trash pickup. So all residential commercial traffic's required to go through the Fairview driveway side. There's for both projects, and this is in accordance with what was called the mission specific plan. You can't have project entrances on Mission. So in fact, Carro's, the Mission entrance is eliminated. They have to use the back entrance for residential. And then, as you mentioned, there's concern about the impact on Diamond. So it can only be used for the service entrance, and there actually is no access to the residential commercial property from Diamond. So, but you're absolutely right that, some of the concern was that this would be an issue. And so we provided a similar condition of approval to the 1020 El Centro project with regard to reevaluating the impact post-construction, and, potential, and the responsibility for potential mitigative measures.
And then on, in the report here, obviously there's going to be 50 rental units for the Arbor property on Fremont. So that's roughly 200, 100 people, 75 to 100. Do you know how many parking spaces then they were planned for the commercial or residential? Because one of the issues that we've always had is how many that, there's the state limitations and all that, but then what kind of potential vehicle parking does it throw on the streets? Potentially. The same thing with the El Centro property. You're going to have 108 units. You're going to have between 200 to 216 people based on averages. And sometimes you're going to might have more than that because we know we've experienced that because of the school district.
Sure.
So
So
it's like, if you have, two families in a 2-bedroom, which we've had, then you end up with 4 vehicles for the property, let's say. And yet where's the parking? And then we're going to throw that all on the street.
Sure. So there is parking evaluations in the analyses. As a public works department, we don't do the criteria evaluation for the development projects. We leave it to the community development. But for the 1020 project in particular, they I think both projects I'm not sure, but I think they exceeded their parking requirement. So I think in the analysis says they had 251 spots for the El Centro 101 units. So they basically expected, 1 parking spot per unit, 108, plus the 66 commercial spots, plus another 77 spots, which are available to the public for use. So I think that their plan was not to, was to provide enough parking on site, because it's not just a environmental requirement for them, it's also an amenity that they want to provide to people that they're advertising to. So yeah, that's where they came for that. But yeah, definitely another concern. So let me jump to the next slide here. So, these were the conclusions of the evaluations. I know this is very brief in terms of the scope of the reports, because they're actually very comprehensive and in depth. But the 815 project, it was determined that it met that presumed criteria that we had talked about, both because it had the small project size. They had 81 trips per day in total, and that's less than 100. And then also that it was in that blue low VMT area north of Mission Street. And now on the other side of that, as far as Public Works is concerned for mitigative measures, it didn't have a significant impact to level of service or queuing, because it didn't change the level of service, and it didn't exceed the queuing threshold. Same thing with 1020 El Centro. It did not meet the small project size and was not in the low VMT area because it was south of Mission. However, is in the transit proximity area, and so it's presumed non-significant from a CEQA perspective. But then also with the evaluation, in terms of altering level of service, we didn't see that, and we didn't see the queuing length impact off of Fairview or Mission. But as I mentioned, both projects with recommendation and approval by the Planning Commission were given conditions of approval because of the concern that the predictive model might not measure up to what actually happens. And so that's the requirement of both developers once construction concludes. So I know that was a lot, but hopefully it makes sense. And any questions?
Thank you very much. We'll go through questions. I'll start with Commissioner Dunlap.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Director Gerber, for the presentation. You mentioned that the city still chooses to utilize level of service. Is that and it's to determine mitigation, right? Or and like what kinds of mitigation would that result
So,
in?
I don't think, so this is from the, methodology that was approved by the council in 2020. And I think that the methodology was drafted by Iteris, but I don't know what the influencing factors were to keep level of service in the methodology.
Mhm.
For us, the mitigative measures could vary. It doesn't, stipulate what they would be in the methodology. But in certainly in considering these projects, like particularly what came up for mitigative measure for the El Centro project was a possible traffic signal at Mission and Fairview. So part of the condition of approval is that the developer actually go through that analysis, that warrant analysis at the time after construction. And if warranted, they would bear the cost of their fair share cost of that signal. Because obviously there could be other factors that contribute to the signal in the future and why it's required, but it would be their fair cost based on the data evaluation. So, and then at the 815 Fremont, it could be, relocating how, obviously the building's not going to move or the parking garage, but configuration changes could be made to the signage or the parkway to accommodate vehicle turning. So there's not a specific one.
Mhm.
It really depends on what happens and then what's the solution to the problem that we're seeing after construction.
Is pedestrian safety something that you look at as part of these reports, or is
Absolutely.
it just traffic?
Absolutely. So as far as I'm only talking about this one condition of approval, but we have pages of conditions of approval that we impose on the developer because, maybe impose is the wrong word, but require of the developer to make those improvements such as, enhanced pedestrian walking.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, the developer, especially the one at 1020 Centro, came forward with a lot of amenities,
Mhm.
even without the requirement. So there's like a pathway through the facility that's open to the public for walking. There's separate entrance for cyclists versus vehicles to sort of mitigate conflicts between cyclists and pedestrians. So if they don't come to the table with those types of things off the bat, either we'll come in with a condition of approval to make some improvements, or generally our community development department is also, per our general plan, they're wanting to see those types of things in the project approval process anyway. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that kind of come together to see those types of improvements.
Yeah, that's good to hear that it's being looked at. I know a concern that came up with the Mission Fairview intersection was you have a crosswalk there, and it's a pretty popular crosswalk. And with the introduction of additional trips and probably a lot of them turning left, you're introducing conflicts with people trying to cross the street there, and so
Sure. So, Mission Fairview is an interesting one because as of right now, we're months away from installing an RRFB. We're, taking that project to bid for construction. So, any changes that in the future would be a conflict with our equipment that we're installing now. So, but you make a good point about making sure that those types of things are enhanced. Certainly I think it was in the literature that they were aware that there would be flashing beacons installed. And so I don't know if they've made any sort of accommodation on the development side about where the RFB is and where people would cross onto their, sidewalk.
mhm. No, thank you. This presentation was really helpful and really informational.
Commissioner Zavala, do you have any questions?
No questions at the time, but thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay. Commissioner Abelson.
Thank you, Chair Fisher, and thank you, Director Gerber. It was a terrific presentation, very helpful, informative. So I have a few questions, and if you can't answer them, no problem. But I feel this is the opportunity to ask them. So the Transportation Impact Analysis Methodology, the TIA guidelines. So it looks like that was adopted in May 2020. One of my questions was who developed it, and I think you mentioned in response to Vice Chair Dunlap that it was Iteris had involvement in that. Does that sound?
I believe it was, and I think it was initiated and managed through the Community Development Department as part of as part of like their, transportation circulation aspect of that work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'll just note that this commission was around at the time, but I don't recall our being made aware of it or involved in its development in any way, shape, or form. And it just concerns me because it controls the city's analysis of these projects from a transportation perspective. So it's a note. I mean, it's nothing you can change. I know,
Sure. So I'll add that we work very closely with the Community Development Department as a Public Works Department. I don't know how it worked previously, but you'll certainly see a change in how transportation policy is made moving forward because it's not that the Public Works Department is taking over that, but by taking on this transportation program manager and taking the lead on these evaluation of these projects, whereas in the past it might have been done internally to the Community Development Department, now it's sort of brought over to the Public Works Department. I think you'll see that those types of, from a policy perspective, moving forward would involve the commission. Now, the only area I'll add to that is that these projects, of course, are approved already. They weren't something that was brought to before MTech. The commission, as it stands, is not part of that approval process. So this is why we're reviewing it sort of after the fact. I know that's been something that's brought up previously, but so our intention is that certainly, I think, like I said, how things should be structured as far as advisement of policy of the council moving forward. I think we want to make sure that we are discussing that with you, but on a project by project basis, we don't have the ability to bring them through commission for evaluation as it stands.
understood. Thank you for that. And so looking at the TIA, in particular, the screening analysis portion and the various thresholds that if met, absolve developer of any detailed VMT and CEQA analysis, right? There are all these thresholds, small project size, low VMT area, et cetera. Are those state mandated? I'm trying to get a sense of, and again, if you don't know, that's fine. But there are all these outs for a detailed analysis. And I'm just wondering, are these ones that the city had discretion in developing, or basically we were directed to include these by the Senate bill or otherwise by the state? Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. It's a good question. I believe they are. I'm not sure if they're mandated by SB 743 or through the CEQA amendments, or there was something else. I think it was like there was like a Global Warming Solutions Act that was passed as well. I think they are, but I'm not sure. But I would like to find that out myself. So good question.
Because it just seems like with all these screening thresholds or outs, that virtually every project is going to result in the determination of not significant impacts, at least from that first analysis. So that's a concern. But if that's the way the state's told us to do it, that's the way the state told us to do it.
I think it's state mandated.
Okay. I had a feeling. And then with regard to the local piece, sort of a similar question. There are these specific criteria that are evaluated, right? The level of service charged for signalized versus unsignalized, are they significantly affected? The queuing, that I'm wondering, because that also seems to tie our hands, because when I look at these, it seems like we're sort of pushed into a determination of no significant impacts in virtually every case. And then what we say is, well, a condition of approval is after it's built and occupied, then we'll do an analysis and find out what really happened or what we know what is going to happen, but we weren't able to require you to do anything. So we're going to do this after the fact study. And I think it's frustrating to, I think, a lot of folks. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity on that local piece to expand the criteria or give us more discretion in terms of imposing mitigations upfront. And just as an example, I think it was 820 Mission, right? Same thing happened. And we said, wait a minute, we know that this is going to create certain impacts on Mission Street. So we should try to control certain of the turning movements, or maybe we can adjust striping or whatever it is. And the developer cooperated, right, and put those restrictions in. But otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do that. So I'm just wondering one, other than this after the fact study, are there any mitigations that we are requiring from a transportation and traffic perspective from either developer? And then two, is there an opportunity in the future to maybe expand our ability to do that ahead of time instead of waiting until after the fact when the impacts are suffered and then we're struggling to get the study done, battling over what are the impacts, what are the measures we can do, and who's going to pay for it?
Sure. So with regard to conditions of approval that affect transportation and traffic, there really is just that evaluation. We have other ones that are sort of ancillary, like we require street resurfacing or structural work or curb ramps, that type of stuff that affect transportation, but they're more like standard conditions that have to be done because the area is being improved anyway. So every standard improvement that we can make in the area is made. But as far as the impact to the intersection, let's say, it's really just that post study with mitigation. The level of service criteria that we've implemented is based on like highway capacity manual methodology. So it is a standard method. I'm assuming there's other things that can be added to it. However, the opportunity to do so, I think warrants a legal question because of and again, I'm getting into an area I'm not an expert, but like the requirements to not obstruct housing development, which I would just make a wild guess that some of the state requirements are intended to facilitate the ease of building housing. So as far as an opportunity in the future, I would guess unlikely because of the other impact and factors. But that's something I'm interested in finding out about. I think it's something that it would be good to ask our neighboring cities what they have done and how they see that, moving forward. I'm assuming they've all adopted this required methodology, but maybe they have other things they've considered.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
One final question. It should be a quick one. Do we, and maybe this is more of a community development question, do we require developers to deposit a certain sum of money as part of one of the conditions of approval to fund the study and potential mitigations which may need to be implemented in advance?
So sometimes we do. Well, so we always have something that we need to hold back in order to ensure that gets done. So in most cases, we can just do it by the process alone, whether it's like a final parcel map, which, they would need in order to move forward with their project, or whether it's certificate of occupancy. In other words, like you can't have people live in that building until you do this stuff, which usually is enough of a motivating factor for them to wrap it up. In certain circumstances, they may ask us to, waive that because of one reason or the other. Maybe they're making an improvement at the facility's already built, and people already live there, and so they can't, withhold the certificate of occupancy for the facility. In those cases, we will ask for some sort of I don't think we call it a bond, but it's basically some sort of like performance-based investment that they have to make, that they have to qualify to get that back. I think we've done that in the past. So in this case, we're not doing it yet, but it's an option.
Great. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Hughes.
Just couple quick questions. Getting sort of into the public works aspect of the construction and the new projects. Converting these properties to the new use is also infrastructure, water lines, sewer lines. So we're going to increase a lot, both. And obviously the we're going to have new lines put in and et cetera. And obviously the developers will do that. We know it's going to tax and add more to water usage, sewer. But are we also, will they mitigate and help us with this? Because we're going to have to going to tear up to get those new lines put in at greater capacity, I'm assuming. And so it's going to mitigate and probably go into the street, I'm assuming. So we're going to have traffic impacted on, I was assuming where the lines would come in and kind of would the water lines be coming in off Fremont, or would we be taking them off Mission for that property? And then, or if you guys
Yeah,
know, and
I'll-
then the other
say and then you
would
can-
probably come from the El Centro side, I would think, for those lines to come in to mitigate as opposed to Fairview, but it's something, one of those streets is
Sure.
going to get torn up.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and
Those are going to be big lines. Those are going to be big trenches. So that's got to be in consideration, and for how long? Because that's going to impact our traffic.
sure. So there's multiple levels to this answer. From a standard perspective, all the projects have to do, they all have street resurfacing work they're required to do because, on a smaller term, a very small project, say like, somebody's remodeling their small retail business. We wouldn't necessarily require them to make street repairs as a condition of the project. We may have them videotape, photograph, document the condition of the street. And then after their project, they have to make the repairs based on the damage they caused. For a much larger project, the street resurfacing work is almost automatic in terms of them having to do the street. We can expect with the loading of the construction vehicles, all that type of work requires that. In addition to the street work, we require them to do upfront hydraulic analysis of their water and sewer capacity, water demand, sewer capacity, to determine what the requirements will be. And so that's packaged into the condition of approvals also. And if you go in the pack, you'll see like dozens of these conditions. With that said, fire flow is the limiting factor in terms of the amount of demand for a facility. So it's not just the drinking water, but like to fight fires. So for A15 in particular, we found that was going to be an issue. They would not have adequate fire service. And so they had to do a model to determine where they would add the hydrant in, how would it get enough pressure. Fortunately, they're actually right on the border of the pressure zone change, so it's feasible. The other part I'll say about this is they have to pay for all of that. So if there are enhancements to the water system, they not only have a requirement to pay those infrastructure upgrades, but on top of that, we also have standard impact fees that kick in for new services. So, larger services can be in the tens of thousands to hundred thousands of dollars in terms of the impact. Yeah.
One lines are the sewer lines, because if you're talking all these residences compared to you just the bathrooms at Caro's
Sure.
and you had the bathrooms at the admin building,
So
very different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say on the private property, it's usually a no-brainer in terms of the enhancements that are needed. For the main lines, part of our other master planning efforts for water, sewer, stormwater infrastructure is to actually take a population growth approach, not just by the sheer number of people that will be added to the city, but based on particularly zone in the city, like for example, the downtown area. So we found through that process that the anticipated growth is accommodated on a zone basis, so that the growth is already anticipated and our system already has the capacity for it. And so it's not necessarily the capacity issue on a city scale that's the issue. It's more so the capacity in the local sense. So in other words, there's enough water and pressure in the area, but at that one particular site, there might not be enough capacity or water. So they have to upsize their system. Now, on top of all that, not to get down into the weeds, but there's, the condition of the assets is an issue. So on top of the impact fees, so that people are paying into the capital infrastructure, our thought is to actually develop a methodology to I'm not yet coming up with the right words here, but to bring in additional funding from a developer impact perspective. In other words, because of how much infrastructure needs to be built in the city to be replaced, you know, bonds, current water rates, loans, grants might not cover all that. So the portion that not just the individual portion on a site that a developer has to pay for their
You're talking
particular
about
unit.
being able to go out into the greater whole.
Exactly, over
because they're gonna
time.
Be impacting that whole area and region because of the increase.
Right, you're bringing more people in, that type
Right.
of thing. So there's a balance there that you have to meet because you can't overly
But
burden a
they are
developer.
contributing. So is that what the
I mean,
bottom
they're
line is?
con-
I want to make sure that there's payment that's coming to cover all. what
So,
really
so they're
needs to be done.
contributing to the impact for their impact fees, which are already adopted by council, and they increase by a factor every year. And then also their specific requirements on site to basically improve fire flow and things like that. Beyond that, we don't have like a developer payment structure other than those two elements at the moment, but that's probably where this
But
would
then we'll
go.
work with them to know when they're going to be doing their construction into the street to get into the laterals and, everything that we're going to need.
Oh,
to do.
absolutely. You know,
That will impact, because those are, but if it's Fair Oaks or if it's Diamond or if it's Mission or Fremont or Mission or Hope, wherever we're gonna do the line work, it's gonna impact those streets.
sure. So out of this 1020 El Centro project, actually, the planning commission stipulated that basically a task force be assembled that would help manage the various construction projects in the city because of that, because of the cumulative nature of all the projects sort of coming about at the same time. We're talking about them individually, but they come about at the same time. And so they wanted to see that there was going to be this basically management of what you're saying of
Right,
the
'cause
construction
you've got
impact
both
here and
of
there.
those
Yes,
happening. You could be impacting Mission over here and Mission over here,
exactly.
not
Yeah.
that far apart.
So the idea is that they're coordinated together, and another reason why our departments have to really work together to bring the projects about.
Thank you. I appreciate the
course.
presentation very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I agree. You've taken a very difficult, complex subject and you've simplified it so that we can understand it. So it was very good. I kind of watched this process play out over the last 7, 8 years. And I'm not a planner type, too much number crunching for me, but I was aware of it. And I was working with Culver City at the time. And so we had to come up with methods to deal with it, much the same as South Pasadena has come up with their methods. My understanding is that the state process, AB 743, had its beginnings when there was a major project up in the Bay Area that had a lot of traffic impacts, and the developer didn't want to have to go to the expense to mitigate them, and wanted to see a more simplified process that exempted those types of impacts. Developer also doesn't want to, even if they could mitigate them, they don't want to have any project with significant impacts. So this process proceeded, and I think from a theoretical standpoint, vehicle miles traveled is a more theoretical, better number of total travel in the area, of total circulation, the number of cars on the road and what distance they traveled. So that is theoretically a better number. I think where the difficulty comes in is that we've been able to identify the number of vehicles that a project will generate through the trip generation handbook. It goes back 40, 50 years, and it's been refined along the way. What we don't have is a wealth of information as to how far each vehicle travels. For example, if we had a 4-story professional building here in the city, to recruit the professionals you need, be they attorneys, accountants, or whatever, you may have to draw upon a larger area. And I don't think there's the wealth of information for vehicle miles traveled. And I think some cities have used the same data now as adjacent cities have used. So there's that difficulty. And I think that's why, and also VMT it's not intuitive. It really isn't intuitive, whereas level of service, if you say you've got 45 seconds of wait time, you kind of know what that means. So I think it better identifies what a driver is going through. So I'm glad you're using this other method, even though it is not a significant impact according to the state. I was going to mention something else, but I forgot right now. But anyway, I'm glad you're using both methods here. But I do have one question. When a project doesn't have a significant impact according to the state guidelines, and therefore has no traffic impact, but it has a traffic impact at the signal according to the level of service calculation, what leverage do you have to require that the developer pay for the mitigation at that location?
Sure. We can require pretty much anything to mitigate that. It's just a matter of at that point it's a negotiation with the developer because apart from any sort of obstructions to development, which are a legal issue, if we put that aside and talk about, we have a concern, there is an impact that needs to be mitigated. We can work with the developer on what that should be. So for example, we had proposed for the 1020 El Centro project, we had proposed this condition of doing this post analysis traffic evaluation. But during the public hearing component, there was a real concern about the need for an installation of a traffic signal. I didn't mention because I don't want to make it too complicated, but the developer actually did a warrant analysis in their packet, and it was found to not require a traffic signal, even though the public comment was, stating that this would be something they were concerned about. And so the planning commission had actually suggested it get added into the condition. And so at that point, we have to discuss that with the developer and see if they're okay with it. There is a lot of standing in terms of requiring that. But if it drives a developer to withdraw their, application and not want to pursue the development because it's extreme and it costs a lot of money, then that's the risk of that. So does that make sense? Or it's kind of a balance of what makes more sense.
But is it a building permit you don't issue, or is it that they need a zone change and you don't grant the zone change if they're not willing to provide the mitigation?
Yeah, it's basically you might not come to an agreement that the planning commission can decide not to, and I'm not a planner either, so I don't know how this works, but my understanding is that they would decide not to grant the entitlement, not to approve the project and move forward. Again, apart from the planning commission's obligation to do so because of not obstructionary housing, the desire is that the project move forward if it's a well-formed project. So you want to sort of find common ground about what to do. In this case, the developer was okay with what was being requested. I think there was a certain level of confidence that it wouldn't be an impact. And so it was an adequate, I'm just assuming here, at risk for them to take to move forward with that condition. But yeah, I mean, we can make requirements, but it's sort of in good faith of coming to terms about what's appropriate, what's fair.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments for the Public Works Director?
Chair Fisher, one quick question
Yes.
following up on that very topic.
Yes.
So when it says the preparation of a traffic study focusing on circulation after the project is completed, I understand what completed means. And then it says and occupied. Do you know what that means? Does that mean 100%? Is there a certain threshold after which they're required to, the study requirement is triggered?
Yeah, we got asked this question actually at the planning commission too, and people ask it also. The developers obviously want to know. I think we generally expect it to be, a year after occupation, so the development can actually, get to its steady state of traffic impact. For us, it wouldn't really make much sense if it was partially occupied and we're doing the evaluation with only half the traffic impact at the facility. So our thought is that it is after it's fully occupied, and it's about a year or so after that occurs that we can know that this is what it's going to be like, basically.
So you're saying it has to be 100% occupied and then you wait a year to do the study? Am I
So
understanding?
we didn't specify that, but our thought was that it should be in a situation where whatever is happening at the facility or the development is representative of what the ongoing traffic impact is going to be. Otherwise, for us, it doesn't make sense because we're not really, we would hold them accountable to whatever mitigative measures were needed. But if it was 25% full and nobody's there, then we're kind of out of luck in terms of getting, when it is 100% full, about getting that, investment.
So is it up to your or the planning department, community development department's discretion to say, okay, now's the time?
Yeah, it's left a bit vague. It could be specified. Honestly, there's so much in these projects that changes as it gets developed that it's one of those things that we just have to determine. And I don't know if it's something we've done classically before because, I don't think we've had these types of development projects.
Yeah, I think this is the third time I've heard of this. I think I think it's called 7 patios, something like that on Centro between Orange Grove and the tracks. We had a similar condition of approval, I think.
I think that might have been similar. Yeah.
So it'd just be interesting to know. I mean, I'm hopeful that the city has the discretion to say, okay, now's the time, because that gives us some, ability. We're not stuck with waiting forever or
Sure.
too soon, like you said.
Yeah. And like you had mentioned earlier, you need to be able to hold something back in order to make sure that you can actually facilitate that
Sure.
happening.
Thank you. And then just to follow up on Vice Chair Dunlap's comments earlier, there's some level of bicycle oriented improvements that we require as part of these projects too, whether they're bike facilities, bike storage, that kind of thing. Does that sound right?
Yeah,
Pursuant to our master plan or otherwise?
there's bicycle parking requirements also.
Okay.
So I think it is, I want to say it's a quarter of the vehicle. I have it right here. One secured bicycle parking space for commercial uses, one secured bicycle parking space for every 4 automobile parking spaces.
Okay.
So because this required 60, they have 251 parking spaces, but because they required 66 for the commercial use, they required 17 bicycle parking spaces. I'm not sure how many they actually put in, but that was the
that's
requirement. Yeah.
helpful and good to know. So that's on the commercial side. Is there anything on the?
There's not a requirement for residential for bicycle parking amenities.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the assumption is that residents would probably keep their bicycles inside, and then commercial users would need access outside for parking.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Ted. We'll
Thank
go
you.
now to item number 4, which is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting in November. Have you all had a chance to read the minutes? So if so, I would ask for any revisions to them or a motion to approve the minutes.
No revisions. I can move to approve unless anyone else has some comments.
I have
Okay.
a couple.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll withdraw my motion.
I'll just keep it high level. So I think the date is wrong. At the top of page 1, the call to order. Should that be November 15th
Oh, it's of October.
instead of October 18th?
You're right.
Okay. A little further down, under information reports, project status update, 3rd paragraph. Let's see, 2nd sentence. It was shared that the final report regarding the fatal accident on, I think it was Marengo at Maple, not Meridian. Does that sound right? everyone?
Correct.
So we might just want to make that correction. Yeah, I had a couple of nits, but those were the significant changes for me. Thank you.
Do we have a motion to approve as amended? Commissioner Hughes, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Vice Chair Dunlap. Okay, all in favor of the minutes as amended, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, 5-0. Thank you. And with that, we'll go to our communication items and we'll ask Mayor Primuth.
Good evening, everyone. We have our first city council meeting of the year tomorrow. We have a pretty full agenda. We are looking at bringing in an interim finance director. Our prior one was unable to complete the assignment, and so we have a new interim finance director arriving. And there's a contract award associated with that. We have a contract to for a company to perform an organizational assessment of the police department. That was a very thorough RFP response, very interesting and experienced company that we have lined up as the preferred vendor on this. We have appointments to and reappointments to boards and commissions. That's on calendar. So Larry is up for reappointment here. Speak now. The council will be discussing the idea of going out for an RFP for city attorney services. So there's an extensive staff workup on what would be involved in putting out an RFP and soliciting responses from other firms who wish to provide the legal services for the city. We have some zoning text amendments to bring our zoning into compliance with various state laws. One of the more interesting things you heard, you might hear a little bit more about Sacramento pushing regulatory changes in terms of development standards. One of the things that we're looking at approving tomorrow is changing the list of permitted uses in an area that has multifamily zoning permitted to prohibit single family homes. Now we have quite a bit of mixed single and multifamily areas of the city in zoning that is actually multifamily. Those single family homes would continue to be permitted, but new single family developments would be not permitted. So it's a ratchet effect of trying to bring in more multi-unit, which of course adds to the housing stock, which promotes affordable housing. So that's just one of the zoning texts. And then the other is to permit mixed use as a permitted use without a CUP, because it's a bit of a hassle to go through a CUP process for a mixed use commercial residential development. So for example, the 815 Fremont and 1020 El Centro, they would then qualify as a permitted use without a CUP. I think that's right. Is that right, Ted? I know you're not the development director, you're public works, but I'll ask you to do a little crossover.
Did you say it one more time?
So the mixed use developments right now have to go through a CUP process. What the zoning text amendment we're doing tomorrow night, if it passes, is to make it it's a permitted use. Doesn't require a CUP to do a mixed residential commercial development.
Yeah, I think you're talking about like not necessarily going through that process and going right to the permitting.
Right, it's a permitted use. You don't have to get a conditional use permit, which triggers all kinds of other analysis because you're mixing residential with commercial, which traditionally hasn't been done.
Yeah, I think I'm not like you said, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's the intent. And the idea behind that is obviously to make it easier to move through the process.
Exactly
Yeah.
right. So that's an example of development standards and zoning that is promoting, more housing and easier mixed use developments. And any questions? That's about all we have on the agenda. We have a very heavy closed session agenda as well.
Land use zoning. Seems like more and more the state is mandating certain requirements that may or may not have been. Has the city responded about the state taking up with
I don't think the city has developed a legislative platform on that. I think we are going to develop it. It's a tricky area because you have a need for a strong need, universally recognized need for affordable housing. And so the policy changes implemented in regulation that we have to follow do take away local control. And when you talk about what's advantageous to us, well, I think Sacramento's deciding what is advantageous for us. Now, we are first fiercely independent community. I see that in our mission statement. So we don't like control taken away from us. But at the same time, there's a policy decision that I think a lot of us would see as a strong need, allowing more affordable units by increasing density. That is happening, and we've lost local control on that. That's fine. That's actually a good direction, I think, in large part. Planning Commission took a look at this. They had some really interesting tweaks. Really proud of how they found some insights into how we can actually customize this. So we haven't lost everything, and our commissions are still finding ways to put our individual stamp on this kind of work. Yes.
I think the one concern always is maintaining historical properties and making sure that the overarching Sacramento dictates would, from a different vantage point, for getting off in the historical properties in historic districts and making sure that as a local, municipality, that we would have some control to protect some of that heritage. Whereas
Yeah.
other communities don't have that same, landscape as far as properties and history.
Yeah, I haven't heard that there's been a problem with interfering with our ability to preserve historic. In fact, the legislation I've heard about has actually been pretty sensitive to the need to allow local jurisdictions to preserve their historical architecture. Certainly the 1020 El Centro project has got a tremendous swath of that project that is adaptive reuse of the existing historical structures.
Thank you.
Actually, and on that, so there shouldn't be any effect on the development because if we remove the historical housing, it's not like we can put more in, right?
Well, yeah, historical designation requires certain characteristics and, length of time and service is definitely one of them.
So it shouldn't, what is being discussed tomorrow shouldn't have an effect on the historical housing.
Correct. And if it's a single family home that's historical, there can be ongoing remodeling, ongoing preservation, even additions. So the existing single family is a permitted use. It's just can't tear down a multi-unit and build a single family. That's not going to be allowed.
Thank you.
We'll go to Commissioner Communications, and this time we'll start with Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm going to be a bit contradictory from our general public comment because I wanted to compliment on the slow signage for a slowdown that is for, I know that are in many different areas of the city, not just on Grand and Hermosa. And I do think it's nice. I also like the new markings, the 35-mile denominators on Monterey. And hopefully those people will adhere to those messages, and we can mitigate some of the traffic and speeding that we know that we hear about all the time. The other question was the accident on Marengo. Have we heard whether the police have given a final report on that, and will that information come to this commission?
So it's a good question. There has been a final report. From what I understand, the county district attorney is pursuing a case related to the report. I'm assuming the report's publicly available. I'm not sure how you would access it. With regard to that issue, we likely won't bring the report itself to the commission for discussion, but the scope of our Marengo study, which in the status report, we talked about how we've altered that scope based on the comments from the commission and the comments from the public, will include the data from that incident as part of the evaluation. So indirectly, the information will be available as we review the Marengo study, but we didn't plan on discussing the report itself.
But the data and the facts can help come into the whole, so we know mitigation or issues to prohibit that kind of a situation happening again as we look at the totality of Marengo. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the scope includes all accident data in the corridor, and so, by supposition, that one as well.
Okay, thank you, Director Gerber. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I have nothing. Commissioner Abelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to congratulate John for his appointment as mayor of our fair cities, and congratulations to you. I want to thank Ted and his staff for all their hard work, including the presentations tonight. I have a comment about the Marengo study, or a question about it. So the study will necessarily include accident data, right? I assume it's a fair assumption, but I just wanted to confirm that.
Yes, there's a review of accident data as part of the scope.
Okay, because obviously the one that triggered this effort was horrific and of concern. But my understanding is it involved a driver who was either inattentive or under the influence. Do we know that much, or has that determination been made? The police investigation, or we're not there yet?
It has been made. I don't recall the specific details, but I know that I think that there's I believe it's a manslaughter charge that's being pursued by the
Okay.
district attorney.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Because what this topic triggers for me is the fact that we've heard over time from a lot of different communities, neighbors, streets, residents about speeding, inattentive driving for people who are cutting through the neighborhoods to get from A to B. And I think it's important that we not only conduct this study for this particular location, but that we keep in mind the pending neighborhood traffic management program that we've proposed. And I know there's some additional work, and then it'll go to city council. And then also whatever we can do to move forward with the slow streets, I think will address some of these issues short term, and then give us maybe some additional tools longer term to address the Marengo location and all the other locations where we have these types of problems. I just wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Commissioner Abelson. We'll go to Commissioner Zavala.
No comments at the moment, other than Happy New Year.
Thank you. And Vice Chair Dunlap.
No communications from me this month. Big thank you to Ted and his team, and back to you, Chair.
Okay, the last item on our agenda is any staff liaison communications.
We don't have any additional communications either tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, I show it's 8:48 and we adjourn our meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.